Hi folks, welcome back for MAT095. We're jumping into chapter 2 now, which is actually going back in the course, but this is usually a problematic area, some elementary algebra type concepts. So we kind of build up your confidence with the first part of the course, and then we jump back to tackle some of these algebra now that you've had some experience with it. So now some technicalities. So within algebra, numbers and letters are mixed together and form expressions. So anytime you have a combination of addition and subtraction and multiplication and division with letters and numbers, those are called expressions. So however, we can define letters and numbers within expressions more specifically. So when we're talking about letters, the proper way to describe them are variables. So because they're unknown quantities, we don't know what they are, but we need to have them represented. So those are called variables. That's the technical name. As far as the number part of it, we have two ways that we can describe it. When it's by itself, a number or known quantity is called a constant. So we're going to call them constants when they're by themselves. And when they're attached to something, then we're going to call them something else. So, for example here, x plus 5, x would be considered the variable, 5 is the constant. Nice cut and dry. When we multiply a variable and a number together, then the number is called a coefficient. Now, why they make that distinction? Well, that's just so when you're talking fancy language down the road, you know exactly what things you can combine and what things you can't. So let's look at this example here. We got 3y plus 4, so y is still the variable. 4 is still the constant because it's by itself. And then we got the 3 that's attached to the y. So the 3 is not a constant. It would be called a coefficient in this case. So looking at our first example, negative 3 plus m, all you're doing is identifying each of the different parts. So again, you got three choices: variables, constants, and coefficients. That's it. So in this case, the negative 3 would have to be a constant, and the m would have to be a variable. That's it. In this case, you got x plus y. There's no numbers, so there's no constants, there's no coefficients. So both of these would have to be variables. And then the last one here, so we have the negative 6g plus 9. So the 9 all by itself is our constant. The g is going to have to be our variable. And now the negative 6 is going to have to be our coefficient. And that's it. So again, it's just trying to be a little bit more technical as far as how we identify the different pieces and parts to an expression or an algebraic expression. So now what can we do with these expressions? Well, the first thing that we should learn how to do is evaluate them. So when you evaluate an expression, you're plugging in numbers for the variables. That's essentially what you're doing. And then just breaking it down using the order of operations. So to evaluate an expression for certain values of the variable or variables, simply replace the variables with the value in parentheses typically. Now there's some exceptions to that, but most of the time it's safest if you put them in parentheses and then you simplify it down. So if we have x plus 3y and we want to evaluate that for when x is equal to negative 3 and y is equal to negative 2, we would have something that looks like this. So the negative 3 is going to replace the x. Now here's the one case where you don't need parentheses. Because it's at the beginning of the expression, that's the one exception. The very first thing doesn't necessarily need them. You can put them in, and it doesn't hurt anything, but you don't need them on the very first item of the expression. So we'll replace it with a negative 3 with or without parentheses, and then you'd have the 3 plus 3, and then the y is negative 2, so again we want to use parentheses and put it in negative 2. So that preserves the fact that we want to multiply here. So if we wanted to break this down properly, the first thing we should do is the multiplication. So I'm going to lose the parentheses around the first -3, and then we have 3 times a -2, which better be -6. And now if we want to add these two negative numbers together, we do truly add them, if we remember our rules, and we should get a -9. Similar type of situation here. We got a times b minus 6. A is -1, b is 5. So let's plug in the -1. So again, it's the very first thing, so we don't need the parentheses around that, times the b, which is 5, so I will put that in parentheses, and then the -6. So -1 times 5 has to come first before we subtract 6. So that gives you a -5 minus 6. Now, if you want to change that into an addition problem, you can, or if you just know that you're going to keep going into the hole, this should get you down to a -11. So, all right, so that's evaluating. We're going to do a little bit more of it in a minute, but we want to hit some other topics first. Now, this next one is another evaluation problem, but it's a little more wordy. So you just got to be careful what is what in this problem. So the expression for ordering brushes for an art class is 3c minus 5, where c is the class limit. Evaluate the expression when the class limit is 12, the class limit is 16. So all this is telling you is that c equals 12. If c equals 12, now we know what to do. We can just plug that in for c. So let's use our parentheses because it's not the first thing. And so we'd have to multiply first. So that gives you 36 minus 5, which equals 31. Now, because it's a word problem, what do I always say? Don't forget your units. So the units in this case would be your brushes. Similar idea for this one. We know c is equal to 16, so we can plug that in. 16 times 3 is 48, minus the 5 equals 43, and then of course don't forget your brushes. All right, so nothing too drastic so far, hopefully. Now, how can we make this more complicated? Well, exponents obviously is a way to do that. Now, just to remember how exponents work, so if we raise something to, let's say, the 4th power, that means we have to multiply it times itself 4 times. And because we have an even number of negatives, we know the final answer should be positive. So, now the one thing to keep in mind is if we're trying to simplify stuff down and rewrite them, just know that we can always unsimplify it, for lack of better phrasing. So we can expand it out. So if we wanted to rewrite without exponents, we should know that this is equal to c times c times c times c times c times c. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them. All right, this one here, we have a -3. There's no exponent on it. There's no parentheses in the expression at all. So -3 is the only instance. But the a is to the 3rd power, so we're going to need 3 of those. And then we're going to need that b on the end. All right, and then the last one, so again, be careful. There's no parentheses, so nothing has a secret exponent in there. So the a is the exponent of 3, so we need 3 of those. The b, there's only 1. And the c, there's 2. So in this case, a lot of people would mistake and give the b an exponent of 2 as well. They think it's implied because the c has it. And that's not the case. So be careful with those. All right, so now when we go to evaluate, we know how exponents work, so we should be able to tackle it when it's numbers. So if we plug everything in, now the parentheses around the whole thing is just there to confuse you. You really don't need those parentheses. But on the first thing, we should put parentheses. Even though I said most of the time you don't need them on the very first thing, in this case you would want to put them because of that exponent. So really to make sure that you include the exponent when you apply the exponent. And then here we also need the parentheses. And so that should be what it looks like initially. And now we can break it down. So we should know that this is going to give you a positive 16. And we got a double negative here, so that's going to become a plus. So you got 20 over 2, which is 10. All right, and now the last one. So we got x is 2, so we're going to raise that to the second power. The y is negative 4, so that's to the second power. So now the first thing we should tackle are the exponents. So 2 to the second. If you want to keep the parentheses, it's fine. If you want to put a time symbol, that's fine. Just remember that you're multiplying. And we know that that's 16. Now from here you can tackle it any way you want because everything left is all multiplication. And remember, multiplication is commutative. So you can combine things however you want if it's all multiplication. I'm just going to go left to right because that's always the safest way to go. And then if we multiply that, we'll get a negative 128. So that's just a first little introduction to some algebra stuff, so getting used to expressions and evaluating. So evaluating is a very important thing, and we're going to see where that comes into play in the next couple of sections. I'll get it out. See you soon.